Okay, well, welcome and thanks for coming today. This is a fun workshop. I actually used it as an opportunity to give my students some extra credit in class last week. They had a salsa making contest. So I had to taste, I think, a dozen different kinds of salsa, and it was great fun for us. So it inspired me too to get ready for this presentation. So I want to tell you first, Healthy Garden, Healthy Home program is a cooperative effort between the University of California and the County of San Diego Watershed Protection Program. The goal is to get the word out to San Diego residents about how we can reduce the use of pesticides in our homes and gardens. Because those pesticides don't stay put, as you'll see with these signs here, they can be washed off of our property with over-irrigation or rain events, and they end up going into the storm drain where they're untreated, and then they end up in the creeks and lagoons and in the ocean. And the university's done research. There's evidence that pesticides, some of the pesticides that are used commonly or that used to be used commonly, have been found in our waterways. So the goal of the program is to help us learn how we can grow healthy plants, control pests effectively, and still at the same time reduce the use of pesticides. So that's the goal of the program. Our information today, of course, is based on growing healthy plants or making your own salsa. So I'm going to focus on that, but I'm going to keep reminding you about the goal of the program and reducing the use of pesticides. Okay, and I'll start with this. So, healthy gardening begins with growing healthy plants that require fewer or least toxic pesticides. So we begin with growing healthy plants because the healthier the plant, the less need for pesticide. So the plants require fewer pesticides, or at least the least toxic pesticides, and for effective control of the common pests that may attack these plants. So using less pesticides in the garden results in a healthy home, and then ultimately using less pesticides at home reduces the watershed contamination and leads to a healthier community. So how do we then, as San Diego residents, reduce the use of pesticides but grow healthy plants that we can turn into food, salsa for our tables at home? So we can do this using a pest control strategy called integrated pest management. The integrated pest management, or IPM as we refer to it, utilizes several strategies for controlling the pests rather than relying on just one. Now, just as you would never rely on using just fertilizer to grow your plants, or rely on any one thing to grow your plants, you don't want to rely on just pesticides for pest control. There's a lot of good reasons for that in addition to the contamination of the water issue, and I'll talk more about those. IPM is scientifically based on the biology of the organisms that interact with plants in our gardens and landscapes. So we can use the information that we know about these pests, about how they feed, the conditions under which they thrive, and things like that to apply the appropriate control measures for the specific organism, which makes the control more effective for the long term. And that's the goal here with IPM, is to make the control more effective for the long term. So this will reduce and sometimes even eliminate the need for the chemical pesticides. So in the long run, this is going to save you a great deal of time and money. You're not going to buy as many pesticides. You're not going to have to apply them as often. You don't have to read so many labels, right? And so over the long term, you get more effective control, and you're going to save yourself some time and money. Okay. So the key strategy for integrated pest management is growing healthy plants. Healthy plants are better able to resist attack from insects and diseases. They will grow more vigorously, they'll be healthier, and that's the reason that we would use less pesticide. The healthier the plant, the more resistant, the better able it is to withstand the attack. It doesn't mean that a pest will never land on your plant or feed on your plant, or a disease won't infect your plant, but the plant is much better able to withstand that. And then it becomes much easier for us to manage those issues. So we're going to look at 4 basic plants that we would grow to include in salsa. We're going to look at cilantro, onions, and also garlic. I'm going to add garlic in there. Peppers and tomatoes. Now, you can apply this information to any of the plants you want to grow for addition to your salsa recipes. You can grow larger gardens, and I'm going to discuss here. So the information will apply no matter how many plants or the size of the garden. Okay, so keeping the key strategy in mind, growing healthy plants. The first thing we're going to do is plan ahead so we can plant these plants properly. We're going to give them the healthiest start possible. So we have to look at our garden space. How much space do we have to allot to this garden? That will determine the size of your growing bed, whether it's a raised bed or in-ground bed. That will help you determine the size of the plants, the number of the plants that you can plant. You'll want to make sure that you're looking at sun exposure. That's going to be very important for all of these plants. And then we'll look at soil preparation, again for both in-ground and raised beds. And we'll look at proper ways to water and proper ways to provide the required nutrition to these plants. So all of this is to make the plants as healthy as possible. So starting with the garden space, as I said, the size of the garden bed determines the number of each plant that you're going to grow. So I looked at a 4 by 4 foot by 4 foot garden bed, and that should accommodate 2 dwarf or bush type tomatoes because they stay smaller, 2 pepper plants, 6 cilantro, and 12 onion and or garlic plants. So you can get quite a bit out of a small garden space. But spacing for these plants is important, and there's a lot of reasons for that I'll talk about. All of the plants I'm talking about today should receive 6 to 8 hours per day of full sun exposure. So, and I'll talk about later on why shade is not a good idea for a lot of these plants. But you want to be careful that you're avoiding planting near walls or fences or any structures that may reflect heat back to those plants. The reflection of the sunlight produces more heat that might be too much for the plants, and it can also cause increases in light intensity that can be damaging to the plants. So keep the plants away from fences, walls, and structures like that, especially the lighter colored ones. Plant your larger plants toward the north or west sides to avoid shading the smaller plants. And I'll talk more about that as well as we go through this. Okay, so the tomatoes are going to be the largest plants in your salsa garden. You want to read the labels on the seed packets or on the seedling plants that you buy, and that it will tell you the proper spacing for mature plants, and it will tell you the size that they're likely to reach. So if you have a 4 by 4 bed, smaller plants are better. Larger growing area, you can go with the larger plants. So you'll choose 1 or more of these for the size of your garden. There are 2 types of tomatoes, determinate habit and indeterminate growth habit. So the determinate growth habits are the bush types. They will stop growing at about 3 to 5 feet tall. Your indeterminate habit plants need a larger area. They're going to grow 6 to 8 feet tall, and then some of the vining types are going to want to sprawl out. So you want to make sure that you're caging your tomatoes as soon as you plant them. You don't want to wait until they're large and sprawling, because then you can't get the cage around them. So put the cage on as soon as you plant them, and keep sort of training them to stay in their cages, so to speak. You can grow tomatoes in a container. You could definitely do a salsa garden in containers as well, if you wanted to do individual containers, things like that. But you'd want to look at the midget, patio, or the dwarf tomato plants that are more compact for your containers. These midget, patio, and dwarf plants are usually short-lived, and they provide quick fruit production. So you can actually grow sometimes 2 or 3 different plants throughout the year. We have a long tomato growing season here. So you can replace the older plants with new ones. And then your cherry tomatoes can be dwarfed to over 6 feet tall. So you want to make sure to read those labels on the seed packets or the label that you get with the seedling plants that you buy, so that you know what size that you're getting. Okay, the next thing we're going to do is prepare our soil. All right. Whether you're working with raised beds or in-ground beds, the best soil for all of these plants, and for many plants in general, is a medium textured or sandy loam soil. So it's going to provide good drainage. It's going to provide pores that hold oxygen and air in the soil as well. Excuse me, and it's going to drain well. So you want good drainage, but you want a soil that's going to hold nutrients, hold water, and have air pores in it. The light sandy soil is a very sandy soil, provides too much drainage, not enough nutrient, and not enough water holding capacity. And a heavy clay soil is going to provide lots of water holding capacity, but not very good drainage. So you can deal with these extremes in soil by adding organic amendments. When you do add organic amendments, you want to make sure they're well composted and they're low in salt, or if you're using bagged materials, that should already be accomplished. So you can use the pre-bagged composts or soil amending materials. When you choose the space for your garden bed, you want to avoid areas with rocks, high salt or salinity in the soil, and excessively dense clay, because your plants are going to struggle to grow in that very dense clay soil.
How do you tell if your composted material is low in salt?
It depends on the source of the compost. So if you know you're getting a manure type compost, it's probably pretty high in salt. So compost that you do with vegetable scraps, table scraps, eggshells, coffee grounds, that kind of compost that you might be doing at home is probably relatively low in salt. So it all depends on what goes into that compost. And you can ask, if you're getting your compost from a green waste facility, you can ask them what goes into this material. Okay? One of the important things about soil preparation is reducing weeds. So if you have an area that's not already prepared, the first thing you're going to want to do is get rid of any weeds that are already growing, or reduce the number of weeds that will sprout when you start watering your garden. The best way to do that is to water, wait, and cultivate. And it works really well. I do this myself at home. I've done it in lots of other gardens. So prior to cultivating or turning your soil, you're going to make sure that the soil is moist, but not wet. You don't want it extremely wet. You're going to cultivate the top 1 to 2 inches. So you're going to turn it over, just a few inches on the top. You can go a little deeper. Rake the area to remove the weeds and the old crop debris, pull out old roots and things like that. And then irrigate that area once you've turned it over, cultivated it. Irrigate it deeply to encourage the germination of those weed seeds in the soil. You're going to wait till they germinate, and then you're going to use a hoe or some other tool to kill those weed seedlings. You're going to cultivate them. You can turn them over into the soil, but you have to be real careful about that, especially if you are trying to get rid of grass weeds. Because grass, typically, if it's a weedy grass, it will break into little pieces, and each one of those little pieces can start a new plant. So if you're working with grass weeds, you don't want to turn them back into the soil. You want to get those out. Once and you can do this water, wait, and cultivate several times. The deeper you go into the soil, the more seeds you're likely to pull to the top. So if you think you've got a lot of weed seed or you're seeing a lot of germination, do this again. So it takes a little forethought and some preparation, but you can do it more than once. Once you feel like you've got as many of those weed seeds germinated as possible, amend the soil with organic matter if it's required, if you have the sandy or clay soil. That was for the in-ground bed. Now, if you've decided you want to grow these plants in a raised bed, you can take that soil from in-ground and form it into your raised bed area. Okay? And then you want to plant while the soil is moist. You never want to put plants into a dry soil. If the root ball is moist or the soil around the roots of your plant is moist and you put it into a dry soil, that water is going to leave the plant roots and go into the dry soil. So always start with a moist soil before planting. Or if you're going to use pre-bagged soil, garden soil, you can put it into your raised bed. And if you're using a raised bed with walls or some kind of wood frame border, you want to make sure that you're not overfilling that, because when you plant and water, you don't want soil running off the sides of your garden bed. So always leave enough room at the top of your border to avoid having that happen. Having said that, though, you want to make sure that your raised bed is deep enough to accommodate the growth of your larger plants, like the tomatoes. Okay? Now, one of the important things is when you're cultivating your soil, you want to break up the clods. So if you have lots of clumps or clods in your soil, you want to break those up, because seeds and roots will dry out very quickly in a soil like that. There's lots more air in that soil than we need, so those plant parts will tend to dry out. But you also want to be careful not to pulverize those clods. So some amount of clumpiness in your soil is good, but you don't want to pulverize the soil to the point where it causes soil compaction. Okay, so that's important. Okay, so let's look at planting these various plants properly once you've prepared your garden area. Tomatoes. Like I said, these are going to be the largest plants in your salsa garden. Homegrown or purchased seedlings. So if you're growing the seedlings at home in a separate area from the garden bed, or taking tomato seedlings home and planting them, they should be 6 to 8 inches tall before you plant them out into the garden. And then they should be well hardened off, which means you don't want to take a tomato plant that's been growing in a greenhouse or a shady area or protected in a kitchen window and set it out in a full sun garden, because it will burn the leaves and the plant is going to struggle and it's not getting a healthy start. So make sure you've acclimated your plants to the sun for a little bit each day, adding time for about 3 or 4 days until they're hardened off and they're ready to go into the full sun. They should be covered with healthy green leaves. So you want healthy green leaves, No discoloration, anything like that. They should look good. You want to water thoroughly a couple of hours before you plant them out. So as I said, you don't want to put moist root balls into dry soil. You really don't want to put dry root balls into your soil either. So make sure your plants are well watered before you plant them out into your moist soil. Excuse me. And then you can plant them in the afternoon. And this will minimize water loss after planting because the temperatures will cool down fairly soon after planting, and it will minimize the amount of water that the plant loses if you were to plant them in the early morning, for example, on a day like today. You water them in, you planted them moist, you put them in a moist soil, and you water them again, they're still going to lose a lot of water. So if you do this later in the afternoon, they lose less water as the temperatures cool down. Please don't mistake this for meaning that you should water your plants in the late afternoon or evening. You should not do that. You should typically water your plants in the early morning hours. And that because you can encourage a lot of disease issues by watering plants later in the day typically. Okay. Your vigorous seedlings can be planted 2 inches deeper than they are in the pot. So tomato plants and peppers as well are one of those, or a group of those plants that can be planted deeper than they are as seedlings in the soil. A couple inches deeper, it actually helps to produce roots on the stem that will stabilize the plant. Keep the plant well anchored, keep the stem nice and strong, and then you get more roots to take in water and nutrients. I want to make a point here that grafted tomatoes are becoming more and more available to the general public. And grafting means that a root system from one plant has been attached to the above ground portion or stem, the shoot system of another plant. Now usually that's done because the root systems on the one plant are resistant to disease and other pests that might occur in the soil, but the fruiting part or the shoot system of the plant produces better fruit. So if we put the two together, we have great plants. If you're getting grafted tomatoes, you do not want to plant the tomato so that the graft is below the soil, because what will happen is the shoot system that produces the good fruit will then produce roots, and that negates the effectiveness of growing a grafted tomato for the resistant rootstock. So make sure if you're getting grafted tomatoes, don't plant so that the graft is below the soil. Keep that graft above the soil. You want to avoid damaging roots and bruising stems. So as you're taking the plants out of the container, you want to make sure that you're gentle with them. Try not to get plants that are root bound, or let your plants, your seedling plants that you grew yourself, don't let them get root bound. So nice healthy plants have roots that hold the soil together, but they're not circling around or creating a massive net of roots. And then bruising stems just injures the plant and opens it up for infection by diseases and other organisms. So be gentle with them, but don't be afraid to give them a firm pat down once you get them in the soil. They don't need to be compacted down, but so they stand up nice and straight. Then you're going to water thoroughly to settle the soil and eliminate large air pockets. We need small air pockets, but not those great big ones that you would get from the cloddy soil, for example. Okay, peppers. They actually are best planted in raised beds. So they do better in raised beds. For direct seeding, so you can plant your pepper plants as seed directly into the garden. But again, you're going to look at your seed packets for proper spacing. The depth of the seed is important. How long it takes to germinate, and the thinning of those germinated seedlings. If they need to be thinned out so they have proper space to grow, you want to make sure you do that correctly as well. If you're using transplants, you're buying them in the store or taking them from your protected seed area or container and putting them out yourself. Again, water them thoroughly a couple of hours before planting, plant in the late afternoon or mid-afternoon. The vigorous seedlings, so seedlings that are healthy and growing well, should be planted to the depth of the first leaf on the stem, about 18 to 24 inches apart. So you can plant your pepper plants fairly deep. And again, they'll produce roots and create a better support system and a water and nutrient intake for that plant. Be careful though that you're not overwatering when you plant these transplants deeper. And you don't want to rot the stem. You want to encourage it to grow roots. So don't overwater. You can use for peppers a high phosphorus granular fertilizer when seedlings have 4 to 6 true leaves. So when a plant first germinates, it gets 2 little seed leaves. Those seed leaves will eventually fall off. They're supposed to, as the primary or true leaves start to develop. So you want 4 to 6 leaves, which would mean 2 or 3 sets or pair, right, of healthy leaves. These should be fully mature, and then you want to mix you want to backfill mix your fertilizer in the backfill when you put the soil in the planting hole. So you mix the fertilizer in or put it in the hole, but mix it with the soil that's in the hole. And then put the plant in. And again, water thoroughly after planting.
What does high phosphorus mean?
It would be fertilizer, let's say, when you buy fertilizer, there are 3 numbers on the packaging. And those 3 numbers could be 15, 15, 15. And that's the percent of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, the 3 nutrients that plants use in the greatest amounts, percentage of those in that fertilizer. So you might want to, you would look for something hot with a higher middle number because that's the number for phosphorus. Okay, cilantro. Cilantro seed or coriander may need to be cracked or scarified before planting. So the seed coat on the coriander needs to be treated so that it will allow water to penetrate into the seed's tissue and allow germination. So you could do this with a nail file or a file that you might use in the garage, and just give it a file so it just breaks that seed coat slightly. Okay? You want to plant the seed a 1/2 inch deep in rows 12 inches apart and thin the seedlings to 6 to 8 inches between the plants after they germinate. Cilantro plants are sensitive to heat, so again, stay away from the walls and the fences, and they will bolt to seed quickly. In other words, they'll go from producing leaves to producing flowers and then seed. So that's bolting. We don't want them, they'll do that in warm weather, so you really have to watch them. If they do this, you can reseed every 3 weeks, through to the cool season for continuous production. So if you have a system going, so to speak, you may have a few plants that are more mature and maybe bolting, and then you have a few more plants that are just beginning to germinate. So you can kind of rotate through them that way. The other thing you can do is cut stems 1 inch above the ground and allow the plant to regrow, or harvest the outside leaves only, and the plants will continue producing new foliage until they bolt. So there's a few different ways here you can get more out of your cilantro. The cilantro transplants, again, should be 6 to 8 inches apart at the same soil level. So cilantro, because of its growth habit, you do not want to plant it deeper, like we did the peppers and the tomatoes. You want to plant them at the same soil level they were when you purchase them or when you take them out of your own seedling containers and put them out in the garden. Okay, onions and garlic. Onions will produce better from seed or transplant rather than from onion sets. So onion sets are usually how onions are sold, but if you can get the seed or get them as seedlings or just growing transplants, they'll actually grow better, produce better. If you're going to go with the seed, plant them about, a 1/4 inch deep and maintain good soil moisture. So if you're planting a 1/4 inch deep, that soil dries out really quickly. So when the weather is like this, you really need to stay on top of that to keep it moist, but again, not overly wet. You can plant more seeds than necessary and then thin the seedlings, saving the strongest seedlings to produce bulbs at about 4 to 5 inches apart. Your soil should cover the base of the developing bulb just enough to anchor it in place. So you don't want the entire onion bulb buried. You actually want to see the crown of that bulb above the soil. Garlic. Most garlic is grown from cloves, which is actually also referred to as a bulblet. Okay? So you want to plant the bulblets directly in the garden. Don't break apart the mother bulb until you're ready to plant, and don't remove that papery covering. It's called a tunic. Don't remove that before you plant them. Okay? Plant 2 inches deep, 4 inches apart, with 12 inches between rows. So if you're going to do more than one row, make sure there's plenty of space. The larger the bulblet you start with, the larger the bulb you'll get at harvest. Okay. Now, we've planted our plants properly. We need to continue to care for them properly. So the cultural practices, or the things that we do to care for the plants, makes a huge difference in the health of the plants and their ability to resist pests and disease. So we're going to look at proper watering and supplying nutrients by fertilizing correctly. So starting with water, I think I've harped on water transplants immediately and thoroughly. And maintain even soil moisture. So you don't want to apply too much water at one time, and I'll talk more about how to get the right amount of water on the plants. But especially don't fluctuate between heavy watering and drying out periods. So if you let the soil get very dry and then you think, oh my gosh, I have to get some water on these plants, sometimes you put too much water on. And with tomatoes, that can be detrimental to the fruit itself if the fruit is developing. And it's also difficult for roots to withstand that. So let me go back to the fruit. If you let your tomato plants dry out, the moisture in the fruit tends to go away or lessen. And then you put a bunch of water on and it forces the swelling of the fruit and it cracks then. So you get what they call cap facing or cracking in the fruit. So maintaining even soil moisture doesn't allow the fruit to shrink and expand. A coarse mulch, 3 to 4 inches thick or deep, will minimize fluctuations in soil moisture. So it helps reduce evaporation of water from the soil. It occurs much more slowly, so you don't get huge changes in soil moisture. And I want to go back to keeping roots evenly moist. If you let the roots dry out, they tend to die back, and then you water them heavily, they're not functioning right, they can't take up all that water, so they tend to sit in wet soil. So if you're allowing that fluctuation in soil moisture, you're making it more difficult for your roots to be healthy and maintain the growth of the plant. So I can't say enough about even soil moisture. However, you want to avoid fixed schedule watering. So, and I think that's probably what most of us do. We all have busy lives and schedules. And we know that if we use an automated irrigation system, they're going to get watered at the same time on a regular schedule. So we don't worry about that too much. But we really should be watering as the plants require it. So we really have to stay on top of this. We don't want to stress the plants by allowing them to wilt, right, a drying out period. So what we want to do is water deeply fewer times per week, rather than say watering for a little bit every day. If we just water a little bit every day, the water's not going very deep into the soil. What we want is for the water to go deep into the soil, past the root zone, so that as the roots continue to grow, they always have moist soil to grow into. And then we can also eliminate the buildup of salts and fertilizer salts. Fertilizers are salts, and the salt will build up in the soil at the roots if we're not watering deeply enough. So it's important to make sure we're getting enough water on, but doing that fewer times per week. So water cycling is important, and the way we do that is we put some water on our soil and determine how long it takes that water to penetrate into the soil. We don't want the water to run off the soil. As I mentioned before, runoff from our residential properties is the major contributor to contamination in our waterways. So we want to reduce that runoff. Besides that, you're wasting water, right? It's running off, it's not doing you or your plants any good. So water until you know the water is penetrating. As soon as it begins to run off, stop the water. Let that water completely soak in. It might take 10 or 15 minutes, depending on your soil. And then you add water again. Let that water until it begins to run off, stop the water, and let that penetrate. And you may have to do this several times with waiting periods in between to get the right amount of soil, water into the soil without runoff. Okay? Now, we should determine our soil moisture. How do we know when the plants need water? Determining soil moisture is best and easily done with a field test. So grab a handful of soil. If you can squeeze a handful of soil and water runs out of it, it's too wet. If the soil does not hold together loosely after you open your hand, then it's too dry. So you want your soil to stay together once you close it up in your hand, open your hand, and if it stays together without water pouring out, but you can kind of touch it and it falls apart, that's good moisture. Okay? So for larger plants like your tomatoes, it's better if you use a soil probe to determine moisture at the root zone. So because water evaporates from soil, the top inch or two or more of the soil is going to dry out first. But there may still be sufficient moisture at the root zone because your larger plants are going to have deeper root systems. So using a soil probe, you can buy them at any garden center, or you can make one yourself. You just want a hollow tube that you can put into the soil at a depth of 12 or 18 inches, whatever the depth of those roots may be. Pull that out and examine that soil. And again, and then you can use the field test for that soil. Make sure it's not too wet, not too dry. Okay, watering properly. I mentioned the water cycling, but I want to talk about sprinkler irrigation. It's good in some situations and bad in others. So it's good for seedlings and leaching salts. Okay, so getting, as I mentioned, getting that salt down into the roots, past the root zone, so that it's not building up around the roots. Sprinkler irrigation is good for that. But again, you don't want to apply it faster than it can be absorbed by the soil. So use that water cycling. Sprinkler irrigation is bad in cool weather, and it contributes to diseases on fruits and leaf molds or fungus diseases that will attack the leaves of the plant. And you always want to avoid overhead or sprinkler irrigation after fruit has developed. Okay, so you can definitely use drip irrigation or water by hand as long as you're following the guidelines for keeping your soil evenly moist. Okay, nutrients. All plants require several essential nutrients. Some of them are used in very large amounts, some of them are used in smaller amounts, but they're all essential. So carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen come from air and water. So we just need to apply the water and make sure there's good air circulation around the plants. Nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium are used in the greatest amounts, and then calcium, magnesium, and sulfur are used in lesser amounts than nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, but still in fairly large amounts compared to micronutrients like iron and copper and zinc and nutrients like that, which are used in very small amounts. But again, they're very essential to normal growth and development. The nutrients are absorbed by the roots along with the water, and the requirements for nutrients can differ at different stages of growth. And I'll talk more about that. Organic soil amendments are a good way to add nutrients to your soil as they break down and decompose over time. They release nutrients into the soil. Organic soil amendments help with water retention in the soil, makes for good water holding capacity. But again, you want to make sure that your organic amendments are not high in salts, okay? But they're very good for helping to provide proper nutrition. Be aware that your commercial soil mixes may contain slow-release fertilizers. So if that's the case, then you want to pay attention to the length of time that slow-release fertilizer will likely last. Most of them are about 3 months. Okay? So if you know you have a slow release in your soil mix, you don't need to add any more until that 3-month period is up. Now, healthy, vigorous tomato transplants, okay, should not require additional fertilizer until flowering and fruit set are underway. So you don't need to fertilize those tomato transplants when you put them out into the garden. If your soil is healthy, you have organic material in the soil, you don't need to add additional fertilizer for your tomatoes. Peppers, though, will thrive from an application of high phosphorus fertilizers at planting. Okay, so again, if you're growing the plants obviously in the same area, you're going to want to apply these fertilizers directly to the plant by side dressing, not just putting the fertilizer out all over the garden. Some of them may need it, the others may not. So just fertilize those plants that require it. Side dressing is putting the fertilizer around the plant at the same width as the plant. We call it the drip line. That's where most of the new roots are developing. And then you work it gently into the soil without disturbing or damaging the roots. Okay, fertilizing correctly. If you are growing your plants from seedlings directly, or from seed that you planted directly in the garden, you probably will want to water these with a half-strength water-soluble fertilizer about every 10 to 15 days. So again, these are just the plants that you started from seed in the garden bed. And again, don't allow runoff of this fertilizer water. So you're going to apply it until it begins to run off and then stop. Okay? Follow the directions on the fertilizer label. It's very important. More fertilizer is not better. And I'll talk more about why fertilizer can actually be detrimental. For transplants, use a slow-release fertilizer in the planting hole. So these fertilizers are released slowly over time, and they will provide the nutrition required by the plant as it continues to grow, but again, mix it into the soil in the hole. Usually only nitrogen and phosphorus, sometimes potassium, which is represented by K, will need to be added to mature plants in garden soils after the fruit sets. So again, side dress, don't apply more than is recommended by the label. But your indeterminate or vining type tomatoes will need more nitrogen than the bush type or the determinate growth habit, because they're continuing to grow, so they need that additional nitrogen. Calcium is usually sufficient in garden soils for tomatoes, but again, we're watering deeply to avoid the buildup of salts that can tie up the calcium in the soil. So there's a reaction between salts and calcium that won't allow the calcium to move away from the soil and into the plant. If you need additional calcium, and I'll show you a situation in which you might, gypsum is a good source for that, and you can get that at most of your garden centers. Okay, too much or too little nutrition. We can over-fertilize. Excess nitrogen makes plants more susceptible to insect pests and disease. And this is because nitrogen promotes vegetative growth. It promotes growth of shoot systems and leaves, not so much flowers and fruit. So what we do is we tend to put more nitrogen on than is required by the plant. It grows very prolifically, but it grows weak, succulent growth that's really easy for insects and diseases to get hold of and attack. So we don't want to apply more than is required by the plant, because we can actually set it up for more problems in the long run. Excess nitrogen will actually delay flowering and fruit set of your tomatoes and peppers. You can also cause the flowers to drop, which of course will then cause the plant to not set fruit. The fruit comes from the flower, so if your flowers drop off, you don't get fruit development. A lack of nitrogen, however, on the older leaves is usually shown as an overall yellowing of the leaves. If the older leaves on the plant are turning yellow, we know that's a nitrogen deficiency, typically because nitrogen is not, it readily moves up into the plant. So the deficiency will occur in the older growth. The new growth may be sparse with the lack of nitrogen. The plant may be undersized or stunted. The plants will grow slowly and the foliage may drop off. So nutrition is very important. We just don't want to overdo it. A lack of calcium can cause this blossom end rot here. You can see where the flower was here, and the fruit developed from the flower. That's what's left over. And we see this a lot on sandy soils, because sandy soils don't hold nutrients well. And we see it with soils that have high salt, again, because the calcium is tied up by the salt. So adding more calcium in this situation may help in the short term, but not the long term. So you want to amend your soils and reduce potentially the salt that's in the organic matter that you're using. So get organic matter with less salt. You can see some deficiency signs here. Phosphorus deficiency shows up on tomatoes very readily, in that it gets the backs of the leaves and the veins will turn purple. That tells you have a phosphorus deficiency. And a potassium deficiency, you'll get this leaf curling on the edges, and then you can see the yellow tissue in between the green veins. If you have both of these signs, it's probably potassium deficiency. Okay? If you just have one or the other, it's likely something else, some other nutrient deficiency, or if the leaves are curling, it could be some other cause. High heat reflected off of walls, for example, can cause leaves to curl up that way. Okay. So, IPM's goal and strategy for controlling plant pests. We're doing everything we can to grow healthy plants Doesn't mean they'll never be attacked by these pests. Okay, so we have to be on the lookout for them. We want to prevent pest and disease. That's the first and most important thing we can do. We help prevent them by growing healthy plants, but there are other things we can do as well, and I'm going to talk about those. It's extremely important to correctly identify the pest or the disease. So you've got two wheels today. One of them was the weed identifier, and the other one was the insect pest identifier. These are great handy tools to have for your garden. You can get more reference materials like this from the university, publications, and then Scott mentioned the pest nodes and all the information that you can get online to help you identify these organisms. So you have a little green card in your packet, and the website is www.ipm for Integrated Pest Management.ucdavis.edu. So I teach plant pest control. I talk to lots of people about plant pests, and I'm always using this website. It's an awesome resource. So I encourage you to use that. Get publications that may be useful to you that you can keep at home and keep them handy. Once we've correctly identified, we want to take steps to reduce the population numbers. We'll never be able to eradicate all these pest problems. They're in the environment. We will not have a pristine environment no matter how hard we try, no matter how much pesticide we use. So it's better to reduce the pesticide use and apply other control measures. And then we're also going to talk about recognizing natural enemies. All the insects in the garden are not plant pests. Many of them are natural enemies of the plant pest. So we want to encourage those natural enemies to help us control the plant pests. So we might provide plants that flower for nectar. Some of these insects, the adult stage will feed on nectar, the younger stages will feed on the pest. So recognizing them, realizing that they're out there and they can be very helpful goes a long way to reducing our pesticide use. I don't want to forget, so I'm going to make the point now that many of the pesticide products you buy they don't differentiate between pest, insects, and the natural enemies. So many of these products will kill everything. If you disrupt the natural enemies by killing them off, the pests often resurge because there's nothing out there to control them, and pesticides have to be applied repeatedly. So you get very short-term control, you're putting a lot more material out there, and because the major source of substances that contaminate our water resources come from our residential properties, we're really encouraging the reduction of those products and allowing these other natural systems to help us control our pest problems. So first we'll look at soil-borne diseases, diseases that survive in the soil and can transfer from plant to plant, and little organisms called nematodes. We'll look at identifying them, preventing them, and controlling them. So our first disease is Phytophthora root rot. It affects the roots, and it requires warm, moist soils in order to cause disease of herbaceous plants. So all of our food-producing plants typically are herbaceous, other than our fruit trees and etc. So we need to pay attention and watch out for this. Flooded and saturated soil can spread Phytophthora to healthy plants. So if you're overwatering, you're allowing water to run off and spread across the garden or the landscape, you could be spreading this disease. So growing a healthy plant will help reduce the incidence of this. Overwatering and those bad practices can actually cause it to be worse or spread. The symptoms of Phytophthora include the leaves appear drought stressed. So what happens? They look like they're wilting. So what do we think? Water, right? And it doesn't help. So what we often see with Phytophthora is that the plant will look great until the warmest afternoon hours, and then all of a sudden it wilts. Even if the soil is moist, that's a good sign that you have a root problem. And it's likely some kind of a root rot or Phytophthora. The leaves may turn dull green, yellow, or in some cases red or purplish. So again, we want to try to differentiate between the purplish leaves of a tomato from nutrient deficiency, phosphorus deficiency, as compared to the drought-stressed Phytophthora leaf. So if you have leaves that are drooping in the afternoon, even though your soil is moist, the leaves are turning a dull green or yellow, or even purplish, that's probably a sign that you have an issue. So when the tomatoes and or peppers are affected by this, roots of all sizes will develop water-soaked spots. So if you were to examine the roots of the plant, you would see those water-soaked spots, and then they dry out and turn a chocolate brown. Our plant roots, in most cases, should be a healthy white color. If they're brown and you can slip off the outer covering on the root, then you have a root rot problem. Okay? So, and you can avoid that by not overwatering. Fusarium and verticillium wilt diseases. These are also diseases that occur in the soil. They can affect our plants by causing a blockage of the tissues in the stem that carry water and nutrients into the plant. So it starts in the roots, but we see it affecting the stem. And eventually what you'll see is that one side of the plant wilts or turns yellow, and the other side seems to be normal. So you'll get the wilt symptoms again appearing first on one side of the plant, above ground, right, the shoot system. So the best way to deal with these, other than some other controls I'll talk about, is to look for plants that are resistant to these diseases. So when you're buying your tomatoes and peppers, you want to look for specific codes on the seed packet or the label of transplants. And you'll notice that the early girl tomatoes that you're going to take home with you today are resistant to Fusarium and verticillium. So plants that are resistant to verticillium have a code V on the label, and plants that are resistant to Fusarium may have an F or FF or both. And because there are different strains of the Fusarium, this is telling us that it's resistant to both. Okay? So we want to look for those and choose these plants because we just won't have these problems.
Back on the root rot.
Yes.
Once your plant has root rot, do you just basically pull it out of the ground?
Most times, yes. If it's gotten to the point where it's wilting in the afternoon, the leaves are turning a dull or yellow color, it's probably not going to ever be healthy again. Yeah. You might coax it through, but it's not going to be healthy. It's not going to produce for you very well. Not only that, but the longer that plant remains in the garden soil, the more of those infectious organisms can survive. So it's best to get rid of them. That brings up another point that I'll talk about in a bit, is rotating the areas where you plant peppers and tomatoes, and I'll get back to that. Controlling soil-borne disease and nematodes. How do we control these? The plants may get them if we're not using resistant varieties or growing resistant varieties. Our soil should be as clean as possible to avoid these disease pathogens and nematodes. Nematodes are little microscopic roundworms that live in the soil, and they feed on the roots of plants. One of the most common nematode issues on tomatoes is the root knot nematode. And this is the damage it does to the roots. So it feeds on the roots, causing these swellings or galls on the root, and it interferes with the movement of water and nutrients up into the plant. So if you have ever pulled a tomato out of the ground and it looked like this, don't put a tomato or a pepper or anything related to them back into that same spot, because just providing food and growing a population of nematodes. So crop rotation, that's important. You want to rotate your tomatoes and things with other plants like lettuce or vegetable leafy plants, root crops, and then the legumes, peas and beans and things like that. So if you rotate through that system like that, you reduce the incidence of these kinds of diseases and nematode issues. Clean soil and debris from your tools, your shoes, hoses, and all that kind of stuff. We can actually move these nematodes and diseases around in our garden by not practicing good sanitation. So keep that in mind. Make sure debris from previous crops has decayed completely if you leave it in the soil or on top of the soil. Okay? If there's still live material, it can be a host for these issues. I want to point out here that onions can get stem and bulb nematode. So you want to watch for symptoms of that as well. On tomatoes, peppers, look for the disease code N on the label. Seed packets and transplant labels, which indicates that the plant is resistant to the nematode. This is one of the reasons that grafted tomatoes have been a goal of many tomato growers, because they can produce plants that are resistant to these issues. Controlling the soil-borne diseases and nematodes is done with good water management as well. Avoid overwatering and provide good draining soil. Don't spread the disease or nematodes with water runoff. Just like you can spread it with your tools, you can spread it again with the water runoff. Avoid applying the excessive fertilizer. Sets the plant up for invasion, right? The tissues are not as strong. And then soil solarization. Now this takes some planning, and you may decide that it's too late in the season for you to do it this year, but you may want to do this for next year, or for example, if you have tomatoes in this part of your garden this year, tomatoes or peppers, you want to move them next year, you can plant them somewhere else. And at the same time, you can do the soil solarization to help get rid of those organisms so that next year or the year after you can put the tomatoes back in that spot. So it can work a lot of different ways for you. Soil solarization is accomplished with clear plastic over a moist soil. And what happens is the sun shines on that soil or on the plastic, on the moist soil, and it heats the soil to a temperature where it kills the disease organisms, nematodes, and weed seeds as well. So it's a great practice, but you need to allow this to sit for 4 to 8 weeks in the warmest part of the year. So it might be a little late for your salsa garden this year, but you can definitely work it in for your future. All right, leaf fungi and weeds. Again, we're going to look at identification, prevention, and control measures. Powdery mildew disease is probably one of the most common leaf fungi that infect plants. All the plants in the salsa garden are affected by this except the onion and the garlic. So again, look for resistant plant varieties. To eradicate mild to moderate powdery mildew infections, you can use a horticultural oil or one of the plant-based oils like neem oil or jojoba oil. These disease spores are in the environment, and they have their favorites, tomatoes and peppers and squash and all of those. Moderate temperatures, 60 to 80 degrees, and shade encourage the disease. So good air circulation is important. You don't want to have leaves close to the ground that maintain humidity in a particular area. So a lot of our vegetable plants do have leaves close to the ground. But if we're providing good air circulation and the required amount of sun for that plant, it's likely it will either not get the disease or get a very reduced infestation. Okay? And then if you do get it, these are some good products to use to help get rid of it. So it looks like this when it first starts. Old damage can look like that. Okay? Keep an eye open on the upper surface and the lower surface of the leaves. As I said, you can control powdery mildew with good air circulation. Some powdery mildews are controlled or kept under control with overhead watering. Okay, they don't like to have water sitting on the spores of the disease, but you want to be careful about that because you can spread other diseases with water, other fungal diseases. So if you know for sure it's powdery mildew, you might use that method, but if you're not sure, don't take a chance on spreading another kind of disease. If you have plants that are blocking air movement into your garden, you need to thin them out so that air can move through them and continue with good air circulation in your garden or your yard. So make sure anything that's blocking good air movement is pruned up, thinned out, or removed if that's your choice. You can get biological fungicides that are commercially available. These are beneficial microorganisms formulated into a product that gets sprayed on the plant and can inhibit or destroy these fungal pathogens. One of them is Bacillus subtilis. So you can look for that in your garden centers. Okay, weeds. Weeds can quickly shade out young crop plants. They compete with water. They compete for water and nutrients, sunlight, space, and all of that. So controlling them is extremely important, especially when your crops are young, and especially if you're growing your plants from seed, because the weeds will grow faster than your desirable plants, and they crowd them out, they shade them out. So keep those weeds out, keep them cultivated, and then look for diseases and insects. These weeds are hosts for lots of the insects and diseases that can then move into your garden. So the nettle-leaf goosefoot hosts the beet armyworm that feeds on tomatoes and peppers. And then black nightshade hosts a disease called bacterial leaf spot. So keeping these weeds controlled, keep them down and out of the garden goes a long way to controlling your pest issues. How do we control the weeds? Primary methods are exclusion and prevention. Keep them from growing in the garden with good soil preparation like we talked about earlier. Never let the weeds go to seed in your garden or areas surrounding your garden, right? One weed scientist said a long time ago that 1 year of seeds is 10 years of weeds. So once they get in there, you're gonna have to do that work to get them out. Cultivate them, get them out. Hand weeding and hoeing is the most important weed management option that we have. Manually keeping on top of them, it's the best thing we can do. Mulching works really well. Again, a coarse textured mulch, 3 to 4 inches deep, that doesn't suck up all your water, right? So bark, gravel, all those kinds of things. And then again, the soil solarization with the clear plastic can kill those weed seeds. If you do use soil solarization, make sure that you don't go in after your 4, 6, 8 week period of heating up that soil and then till it too deep, because you're just going to pull those organisms that are deeper into the soil back up to the surface. So once you soil solarize, be ready to plant in that area without deep tilling. Okay, insect pests, snails, and slugs. These are probably the ones we see most often. And the best way to deal with these is to be on the lookout for them and scout for them. Actually be an active scout in looking for these organisms. So aphids here, they like the new terminal growth, especially if it's over-fertilized with nitrogen. Whitefly can be found underneath the leaves of plants. They like tomatoes and peppers and all of those. Thrips, very tiny, tiny little insects. So you want to pay attention. They like flowers, and they will also feed on your onion leaves. So keep an eye out on your onion leaves for these little tiny insects. And then sooty mold is a result of the excrement produced by the aphids and the whitefly and other insects that suck out plant sap. They suck out the sweet, sugary plant sap, but they excrete most of it. So this is called honeydew. Okay? Yeah, I know. Funny name for insect poo. But that sugary, sticky substance on the leaves of your plants, on your fruits, creates an environment for this sooty mold to grow. The sooty mold's in the environment, it lands in the sugary honeydew, and it's a food source and it goes crazy. So it's not a plant disease in itself, but it can reduce photosynthesis. The sun that penetrates the leaves can be reduced because of that black mold on the leaves, and oops, sorry about that. It's very unsightly on your fruit and all of that. All right, leaf miner, also very common. The adult lays her eggs underneath the waxy covering on the leaves, and the larva stage mines its way through the leaves, feeding on the plant sap and the cells. So this is a sign here that you have a leaf miner. Hornworms. Yeah, I'm sure if you've grown tomatoes or any other kind of vegetable, you've seen the hornworms, right? Those are usually, the leaf miner and the hornworms can be found early in the season, and then snails and slugs, always be on the lookout for those, and we'll talk about dealing with them. There are a couple of new pests that we want to make you aware of, because they can be difficult in your garden, but they can also cause problems for agriculture in the county or in California as a whole. The new kids in town, the first one is bograta bug. These are the little immature stages. Don't confuse them with lady beetles. Lady beetles are going to have red or orange wings, typically with spots on them, but you'll never see some lady beetles have black wings and etc. So you want to learn to differentiate between those. This is the adult stage, and you can see here there's different stages of insect development here. They are observed typically in organic farms and community gardens and residential vegetable gardens. They cause feeding damage on the fruits of pepper, bell pepper, melon, papaya, tomato. The best way to deal with these is to be on the lookout for them, check your plants regularly, hand pick, or even get your shop vac out and vacuum them out. Get rid of them. You never thought of vacuuming your garden, did you? Soapy water, or I should say insecticidal soap, okay, is a good way to control these. Insecticidal soaps, very little to no toxicity at all in the garden as far as getting into our water resources, and can be very effective controls for a lot of our garden pests. So insecticidal soaps for those. And then additionally, the brown marmorated snake bug. This one is a reportable pest, and it's because it can have negative impacts on agriculture, not just home gardens, but agriculture at large. So it's abbreviated BMSB. It can reach high numbers, and since one bug can feed on many fruit, losses can be severe. The adults and the younger nymph stages suck the juices from the fruit and seeds. They damage fruits like citrus, fig, berries, grapes, beans, vegetables, and a lot more. They will seek winter shelter, and large numbers will congregate sometimes on the outside of your house. They're seeking warmer temperatures in the cooler months, so they'll start congregating on your walls. So you want to learn to identify them. There are particular markings that you can use to identify them. So you have a handout about those in your packet. If you find them, please report them by putting them in a container. It could be a sealed sandwich bag or Old Spice jar, whatever it is that you have. Make sure it's sealed up and take it to your county agricultural commissioner or your local University California Cooperative Extension office. You can call the Master Gardener hotline to find out where these locations are, or get on the university website to find the location. It's important that we take part in helping to reduce the spread of these insects because, as I said, they can cause larger problems in agricultural production. So how do we manage these pests? We're going to focus on the long-term goal instead of the short-term satisfaction of zapping them with pesticides. So managing aphids, leaf miners, whitefly, thrips, and stink bugs, which the bagrata bug and the marmorated stink bug are part of that group. You want to identify and allow their natural enemies to prey on them or parasitize them. And I'm going to show you some natural enemies in a minute. The aphids, you can pick them off by hand. They like that new growth. Just go out there and wipe them off with your finger and your thumb, pick them off the flower buds and all of that. While whitefly can be reduced by pruning to allow good air circulation. So you're looking for those underneath the leaves. See populations building up. Make sure your air circulation is good. Clip off and remove older leaf miner infested leaves. If you don't want to pick too many leaves, right? You don't want to strip your plant of leaves to get rid of the pest. But if you're paying attention, you can get rid of the older ones. And you can knock thrips and whitefly off with a spray of water. So if it's your watering day or your soil needs some water, your garden needs some water, you can use a high pressure spray, a spray nozzle, and spray the leaves down and knock these pests off. Insecticidal soaps and horticultural oils are extremely useful and important. Other more toxic pesticides are not effective, especially on things like whitefly. They have built up a resistance to most of the pesticide products we have that can be used on them anyway. So they're not going to be effective, and you can increase, as I said before, you can increase the population of the pest by killing the natural enemies. So just because you can buy a pesticide product doesn't mean it can be used on every pest, and doesn't mean it's only going to kill the pest you're trying to kill. So just keep that in mind. You can manage the hornworms, any of the caterpillars, loopers, and the bagrata bug, as I said, by hand picking or vacuuming off the bagrata bug. You can use the microbial products like BT, also called Bacillus thuringiensis. You can find that in most of your garden centers. And then moderate to low numbers of the looper caterpillars and the hornworms can actually provide, they can actually be hosts for beneficial parasites that attack other fruit worms. So, and that brings up the point that we need to be able to accept and tolerate some number of these organisms in the garden. As I said before, we'll never completely eradicate them. So keeping their numbers low, keeping the populations low, keeping an eye out and managing them is our best defense. Trapping snails and slugs. Use copper strips around the upper edges of your raised bed. As the snails climb up the sides of the raised bed, they get stuck under those copper strips. and then you just collect them and throw them out. You can also do this with cantaloupe rind that's been hollowed out after you enjoy your cantaloupe. Turn it upside down in the garden and make sure the snails have a little space to get underneath it. They'll collect in that moist, dark area, and then you can just pick it up and throw them away. You can also do this by making a trap out of plywood that's, again, elevated slightly above soil, and they'll climb underneath or crawl underneath there and stay there. You just flip it over, scrape them off, and throw them away. So trapping snails and slugs is your best bet. All right, our beneficials include lady beetle adult and her larva. These are only about 1/4 inch long, but they will eat many aphids at this stage in the life cycle. And then the adult also will eat them, not as many as this stage, but we all know lady beetles are good, and that's the reason. They love to eat aphids. Green lacewing adult and her larva. The adult feeds primarily on nectar, so it will visit the flowers in your garden. So you can encourage these beneficial organisms in that way. And this larva stage is 1/8 to 4/5 inches long. Again, very small, but they're voracious consumers of aphids. So they're great to have around. You'll see these on your porch lights at night, or sometimes if you disturb the shrubs during the day, they might flutter out. So they're around all the time. Minute pirate bugs. You want to learn to identify these because there's lots of insects that have these similar structure and markings. We can learn to identify this one. They are good pest control. Beneficial depilate snails. If you see these kind of snail shells in your garden, don't disturb them, and don't use snail bait, because the snail bait will kill these. These snails will consume eggs and sometimes smaller snails as well, the brown garden snails and such. So those are good to have around. And then this guy's here, he's called the devil's coach horse. He will also eat snails. So when you find insects like this in your garden, they're very likely a good thing, not a bad thing. Okay? So I want to remind you, the short-term satisfaction of using pesticides costs everyone. They're not effective, especially for the long term. So they're expensive to purchase. And as I said, most of this material that ends up contaminating our waterways comes from residential property. So we can go a long way to reducing that by just following some of these basic principles of healthy gardening. If pesticides are applied incorrectly, they can have toxic effects on those organisms we didn't intend to harm. Residues on plants, baits and other materials on the ground can be picked up by children, pets. Again, the beneficial insects will be killed by most pesticides. And then you can actually cause harm to your plants by applying the wrong material. And this brings up the point, if you do use horticultural oils and natural plant-derived oils, do it in the early morning hours when it's cool and the plants are watered. If you apply oils to a plant that's dry during a hot part of the day, you can burn up the plant. So use those products correctly as well. They are not toxic, but they need to be used properly. So keep in mind, with rain events, water runoff from our properties, all of these materials go into the storm drain and they remain untreated and end up in our watersheds, in the lagoons and the bays and in the ocean. They can have very negative impacts on the food web in these areas. And besides that, these are our water resources, and we need to protect them, take care of them for our recreation, our water supply, and for the wildlife and habitats that we are so fortunate to have here in San Diego. So use the pesticides correctly. Use the least toxic chemical that will control the pest you're trying to control. And again, the soaps and oils. Read the label. of any product that you use to make sure it's appropriate for the pest. So again, correct identification so you can apply the appropriate measures. You want to read the label also for possible toxicity to plants and effects on beneficial organisms. If you do have to use a more toxic material, just spray the area that needs treatment. You don't have to spray the whole garden or the whole yard. So just spot spray. And then avoid drip. Apply any pesticide product, soap or oil, earlier in the morning when there's not a lot of wind or air movement, because you don't want these materials drifting on to other plants in your yard or somebody else's. Okay, so when you're reading a pesticide label, the primary thing is the active ingredient. Azadirachtin is derived from the neem tree, so this would be something that would be safe and less toxic to use. All right, so look for that and then read about the product itself and how it works. So we'll remind you, it's the water that connects us. Read those labels, follow directions, both fertilizer and pesticide. Store your pesticides in a safe manner. They should always be locked up in their original container. And dispose of unused pesticides properly. If you have materials at home that you no longer use or don't want to use, you can call this 1-800-CLEANUP and find out where the nearest pesticide disposal spot is in your community. And they'll drop them off, no questions asked. Okay, and some other numbers you might find important as references or resources to help you with any gardening issues that you may have. Thanks for your attention today. If you have questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Otherwise, if you're ready to go, get your tomatoes and enjoy your salsa garden. Thank you very much.